The wind screamed across the frozen world, carrying the scent of blood and fire through a land buried in ice. A lone hunter, taller than any man alive, fell upon the plains, his breath fading into the snow. But before death could claim him, shapes emerged from the storm. They were Neanderthals, broad, fur-cloaked, silent. And instead of leaving him to freeze, they carried him home. That night, two kinds of humans shared the same fire for the first time. It was not war that bound them, but mercy. What followed would change everything we thought we knew about survival, compassion, and the dawn of humanity itself. Like, share, and subscribe, and tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Let's see how far this ancient fire still burns, as we return to the Ice Age, where the strong and the gentle learn to survive together. The wind moved like a living thing across the white world, sweeping through the endless plains of ice and stone. It carried with it the cry of distant herds and the whisper of a storm rising in the west. Beneath that vast, frozen sky walked a man unlike any other. His shadow stretched long across the snow, broad-shouldered and towering, a giant among early humans. His breath came out in heavy clouds, his fur cloak stiff with frost, his eyes fixed on the dark shapes moving ahead, a herd of steppe bison, their coats dusted with snow, their breath steaming in the cold air. He had been following them since dawn, tracking the prints they left across the drifted plains. Every movement was measured, every step deliberate. Hunger drove him onward, but so did something older than hunger, the rhythm of survival that had shaped life on this continent for thousands of years. He carried a spear of sharpened stone bound with sinew, its shaft carved from mammoth bone. The air shimmered with cold, each breath freezing against his beard. As the herd reached the edge of a frozen ravine, he saw his chance. With a deep exhale, he broke into a sprint, snow exploding beneath his feet. The nearest bison turned its head, eyes wide with fear, and in that instant he drove the spear forward with all his strength. The impact rang through the valley like thunder, but the shaft snapped, splintering in his hand. The animal staggered but did not fall. Panic erupted. The herd thundered forward, the ground shaking beneath their hooves. The hunter tried to turn back, but the snow gave way. The ice beneath him cracked open with a sound like shattering glass. For a moment, his world tilted, the horizon spun, and the sky folded over him. He fell through the crust of snow into the jagged rocks below. The sound of impact echoed across the plain, then vanished into silence. The herd disappeared into the storm, leaving only the stillness of the tundra. For a long time, nothing moved. The snow drifted gently over his motionless body, covering his broken spear and the trail of blood that spread across the white ground. The storm grew heavier, erasing every trace of the struggle. Above him, the wind howled through the emptiness, a lonely song in a world without witness. Night began to fall. The cold deepened, and the air thickened with flakes of ice. Somewhere in the distance, hidden by darkness, the glow of a fire flickered against the cliffs. Its light danced faintly across the frozen earth, as if the world itself had noticed what the storm was trying to hide, a fallen giant, still breathing, waiting for something or someone to find him. Night fell quickly over the tundra, swallowing what little light remained. The wind softened to a low hum, and the snow began to fall in thick, soundless sheets, erasing the world one flake at a time. Beneath the cliffs, the land turned ghostly. The air itself seemed to freeze mid-breath, every movement slowed by cold. Out of that fog and frost, shapes began to appear, dark, broad, and deliberate. They moved with the quiet rhythm of experience, their bodies wrapped in thick layers of hide, their hands gripping heavy spears of flint and bone. These were Neanderthals, the ancient keepers of the Ice Age world. They traveled as one, a small family bound by the same cold and the same need. Their senses were tuned to the faintest sound, the crack of ice, the scent of marrow in the air, the shift of distant snow. Tonight, the air smelled different. There was the iron tang of blood, sharp and fresh, carried through the fog. One of them grunted softly. and the group turned toward the scent. The glow of their fire torches wavered against the white void, revealing a trail that led to a dark form half buried in the snow. The body was massive, the snow around it steamed faintly, and the crimson spread slowly outward, melting the frost beneath. They had seen death before, had lived beside it all their lives, but this was something strange. The creature before them was human, yet not one of their own. His limbs were long, his frame towering, his skin lighter than the smoke of their fires. His hair was tangled with frost, and his chest rose only faintly with breath. The Neanderthals stood around him in silence, their faces expressionless, the snow collecting on their fur. The wind shifted again, carrying the low groan of the storm across the plains. One of them moved closer, squatting low beside the fallen giant. With careful hands, they brushed away the snow covering his face. The skin was cold but not yet lifeless. A pulse stirred beneath the surface, weak but steady. The Neanderthal placed a broad hand upon his chest, feeling the faint rhythm of a heart still fighting beneath the cold. Around them, the others waited, breathing slow, their torchlight flickering over the ice. The decision was unspoken. They were not creatures of cruelty but of instinct, and in that moment, instinct told them this life, no matter how unfamiliar, must not be abandoned to the storm. The eldest nodded once, and two of them bent down, gripping the stranger by his arms. Together, they lifted him from the snow. The night swallowed their footprints as they carried him toward the cliffs, the firelight trailing behind like a thread of hope in the darkness. Above them, the wind screamed across the peaks, but beneath its cry moved something older and quieter, the first stirrings of mercy in a frozen world. Beneath the towering limestone cliffs, where the wind could no longer reach, a faint glow pulsed against the darkness. The entrance to the cave was narrow and half hidden by hanging roots and snow, but within lay warmth, the kind of warmth that had kept generations alive through endless winters. Inside, a fire burned low, its light turning the walls red and gold, its smoke drifting lazily toward the ceiling where ancient soot had gathered from 1,000 nights before. Around that fire moved the Neanderthals, slow and deliberate, their faces carved in shadow and flame, and among them now lay the wounded stranger they had pulled from the snow. The air smelled of pine resin, earth, and animal fat. The walls shimmered with moisture, glistening like veins of stone. They worked silently, guided by habit rather than language. The stranger's frozen garments were stiff as bark, his skin pale beneath layers of dirt and blood. Steam rose as they removed the soaked furs, revealing scars and wounds carved deep into his flesh. They pressed warmed moss and chewed roots against the injuries. Substances they had learned through generations could draw infection from the body. Each motion was measured, each touch precise, born not from sentiment but from the quiet understanding that survival was never meant to be solitary. The fire crackled softly, feeding on pine and bone. Its glow reached across the chamber, painting the walls in trembling light. Shadows of hands moved over the stone, the shapes of caretakers in an age before words. The flicker of flame revealed the faces of the Neanderthals, heavy-browed, strong-jawed, eyes reflecting an ancient intelligence that knew the language of pain. They had tended to their own sick and aged before. They had buried their dead with care, placed flowers and tools beside them. Now that same instinct extended to the stranger who did not belong to them, yet bled and shivered the same as they did. Outside, the storm raged unseen, snow piling against the cave mouth until the world beyond disappeared. Inside, time slowed. The only sound was the crackle of wood and the faint rhythm of the stranger's breath returning. The fire's heat softened the air, and the scent of resin grew sweet and heavy. For the first time, two species of human shared the same light, their differences hidden by the shadows that joined them. As the night deepened, the flames painted their faces in the same color, the color of survival. In that fragile circle of warmth, mercy became the oldest story ever told, not through words, not through thought, but through the simple act of keeping another alive. The cave walls held the memory, the fire sealed it in silence, and the storm outside could do nothing to erase it. For 3 long days the storm did not rest. The wind screamed through the gorges, dragging walls of snow across the plains until the earth and sky became one endless blur of white. The mouth of the cave disappeared beneath ice and drift, sealing those within from the frozen world outside. Inside, time lost meaning. The rhythm of day and night vanished behind the roar of the storm. Within the dim glow of the fire, life clung to its fragile warmth. The wounded giant lay motionless near the hearth, his body trembling between fever and exhaustion. His breath came in shallow bursts, his chest rising and falling in rhythm with the flicker of flame. Around him, the Neanderthals moved with quiet purpose. Their world had always been harsh, shaped by scarcity and endurance, but in this moment their struggle was not only for themselves, it was for him as well. They worked without speech. A bowl of bone broth simmered over the coals, thick with marrow and melted snow. One of the women drew the liquid through a hollow bone and let it trickle into his mouth, drop by drop, keeping him alive when his strength failed to return. Another knelt by the entrance, breaking blocks of snow and pressing them against his burning skin to calm the fever that gripped him. The air smelled of pine smoke, wet fur, and the faint sweetness of heated resin. The firelight played across the stone walls, revealing the traces of their world. Antler tools hung from ledges, cracked bones piled for fuel, skins stretched to dry. These walls had seen generations come and go, storms rise and fade, yet the scene unfolding now carried a quiet weight, a merging of lives that would never have met had the earth been kinder. Outside, nature showed its cruelty. Inside, the last embers of warmth showed its grace. Hours blurred into days. The storm's voice deepened to a constant growl, and snow pressed heavier against the stone. But the small circle of flame endured, a fragile defiance against the cold. In its light, their shadows mingled the giant's long limbs beside their compact forms, different yet united by breath, by effort, by the shared will to keep life from slipping away. When the wind finally broke and the silence of dawn returned, the cave smelled of smoke and earth. The giant still breathed, his fever had eased, and color had returned to his lips. Around him, the Neanderthals rested in silence, their faces lined by fatigue but softened by something older than words, the quiet satisfaction of mercy. Outside, the storm had buried the world. Inside, something had survived it. Morning arrived without light. The storm had passed, but the sky remained the color of stone, the horizon lost beneath veils of mist. Inside the cave, the air hung heavy with the scent of smoke and pine resin. The fire, long tended through the night, had burned low, its last coals glowing red against the ash. The warmth radiated softly across the chamber, a fragile island of life surrounded by the chill of a frozen world. The giant stirred at last. His eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes clouded by exhaustion and pain, yet still aware. The light of the fire shimmered across his pupils, reflecting the same flame that had kept him alive. He tried to rise, but weakness pinned him down. The sound that escaped his throat was barely more than breath. Around him, the Neanderthals watched in silence, their faces unreadable, their breath visible in the cold air. They did not speak in the way he knew. Their language moved through tone, expression, and gesture, not words, yet meaning flowed between them effortlessly. The old female who had tended his wounds reached forward, her hands thick and scarred from years of shaping stone and scraping hides. She pressed her palm against her chest, then against his, repeating the motion with quiet purpose. The gesture was simple, but its meaning was profound. It was an acknowledgement of life, a way of saying, "You are here. You are still among us." He did not understand her sounds, but instinct guided him. He mirrored the gesture, hand to chest, hand to her. Their eyes met in the half-light. Between them passed something far older than language, older even than the fire that warmed them. It was recognition, the awareness that, despite the differences of bone and form, they shared the same fragile pulse of existence in a world that gave nothing easily. The fire crackled softly, feeding on the last pieces of wood. The others moved around the chamber, adding snow to melt for water, mending furs, tending to their tools. The rhythm of life continued as it always had, Yet the cave now held a new presence, an unfamiliar harmony. The giant no longer seemed a stranger or a burden. He was part of the circle, breathing the same air, sharing the same warmth, bound by the same need to endure. Outside, the world lay buried beneath fresh snow. The wind had fallen silent, leaving only the distant drip of melting ice from the cliffside. Inside, the first morning of calm settled over them. The fire glowed brighter, its reflection flickering across the stone walls like the first dawn after creation. For the first time since the storm began, the world felt still, and within that stillness, two kinds of humans shared the same light. Days passed, and the rhythm of life slowly returned to the cave. The giant's strength came back in small fragments, first in the twitch of his fingers, then in the steadiness of his breath, and finally in the way he sat upright to watch the others work. The fever that once gripped him had faded, leaving behind a stillness that felt like rebirth. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in silence. Inside, the cave pulsed with quiet purpose, the center of their world glowing in amber light. The fire was more than warmth. It was teacher, companion, and memory keeper. Its light revealed the slow choreography of daily life, the scraping of hides, the grinding of bone, the rhythmic chipping of stone against stone. Every motion was deliberate, shaped by generations of repetition. The Neanderthals worked with a precision born from necessity, their thick hands capable of remarkable grace. They flaked stone cores into perfect edges, hollowed bones to hold marrow, and used sinew to bind spears that could bring down beasts many times their size. The giant watched, learning their rhythm. His own people hunted differently, with longer blades and lighter tools. His height gave him reach, but their technique gave them mastery. Slowly, he began to imitate them. His movements clumsy at first, then surer with each passing hour. They accepted his presence with quiet patience, neither wary nor welcoming, simply aware that another set of hands meant greater chance of survival. When the firelight dimmed, he worked beside them, showing a new way to sharpen the flint blades with thinner flakes, creating finer, deadlier points. The sparks flew in bright arcs, scattering like insects in the dark. They observed in silence, their heavy brows furrowed with curiosity. Around that shared fire, knowledge passed not through words, but through the rhythm of action, the oldest language of all. They learned from one another in the only way the Ice Age allowed, by doing, by enduring, by watching the hands that made life possible. The firelight turned their faces gold and red, blending shadows until the differences between them seemed to fade. The giant's long limbs moved in unison with their shorter, stronger forms, all guided by the same necessity to survive another night in a world that demanded everything. As the flames grew low, one of them added a final branch. The light rose again, painting the stone walls with warmth. Around it, a family of two species sat together, not bound by speech but by shared breath and purpose. The fire spoke for them, crackling softly, its glow dancing on the walls like a teacher repeating an ancient lesson that survival was never a solitary craft. The winter loosened its grip slowly, as if reluctant to surrender the land it had ruled for so long. The ice on the river cracked first, sending echoing groans through the valley. Then came the smell of thawed earth, rich and heavy with promise. The air grew softer, the wind less cruel, and faint traces of green began to push through the frost. For the Neanderthals and the giant who now lived among them, this change meant only one thing: the herds would return. Far across the open plains, the silhouettes of reindeer began to move once more, their migration as ancient as the ice itself. The animals came in waves, crossing the valley floor like a tide of life. They brought with them the scent of musk and the sound of hooves striking the softened ground. For the small group of hunters who had endured the long cold, it was a signal that the world still offered reward for patience. Preparation began quietly. Spears were repaired, bindings retied, and points sharpened by the same hands that had once tended wounds and stirred fires. The rhythm of survival shifted again, from endurance to pursuit. The giant, now stronger, joined their work. His stature, a towering form against the horizon, gave him sight far beyond the ridges. The Neanderthals relied on coordination, the silent communication that came from generations of shared hunts. Together, they formed a circle of skill and instinct that blurred the boundary between species. When the moment came, they moved as one. The herd grazed along the riverbank, unaware of the danger hidden in the wind. The hunters advanced low and steady, their movements precise, their breaths measured. The giant raised his spear, carved anew with flint tips thin enough to pierce the thick hide of a reindeer. The Neanderthals spread around him, each one reading the other's motion through subtle signs, a nod, a glance, the soft crunch of snow. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, the silence broke, the air filled with the thunder of hooves and the deep sound of pursuit. The hunters closed in, the giant's long stride covering the distance with powerful speed. The spear flew, cutting through the cold air and striking true. The herd scattered, but one animal fell. The sound of its collapse rolled through the valley, followed by the echo of human voices raised not in dominance but in relief. The hunt ended with warmth, with the scent of blood mingled with thawed soil and melting ice. The fire that night burned brighter, fed by fresh marrow and the satisfaction of survival. Around it, figures sat shoulder to shoulder, their laughter low and deep, blending with the crackle of flame and the whisper of wind through the gorge. In that moment, the great divide between them vanished. They were simply hunters beneath the same sky, bound by the oldest truth the earth had ever known: that to live, they must endure together. The plains had awakened. Where once ice had ruled, rivers now moved with the restless energy of spring. Meltwater from distant glaciers thundered down from the highlands, carving silver veins through the dark earth. The sound of it filled the valley, a deep, rolling pulse that spoke of both renewal and danger. For the hunters who followed the herds north, the river marked both a path and an obstacle, a reminder that survival was never earned easily. The reindeer moved ahead of them, gliding through the mist like pale ghosts. The air was thick with their scent, a musky signal of life after hunger. The Neanderthals advanced in steady rhythm, their furs damp with melt and their feet sinking into the thawing ground. The giant walked among them, his steps heavy but sure, his presence a tower of strength against the churning wind. Together they had learned the rhythm of migration, the patience to follow, the instinct to adapt, the unspoken trust that bound them in the pursuit of survival. When they reached the river, it was wider than they remembered. Sheets of ice drifted on the surface, colliding with dull cracks that echoed across the valley. Beneath the broken crust, the current surged with hidden force, cold enough to kill within minutes. Yet beyond the river lay the open plains, the feeding grounds that promised meat and marrow for weeks. There was no choice but to cross. The Neanderthals moved first, testing the shallows with long branches. The water bit through their hides, numbing fingers and feet. The current pulled at their legs, dragging with invisible weight. One misstep meant being swept beneath the ice. The giant waded behind them, his frame breaking the flow, the water rising only to his waist. The river clawed at him, but his strength held firm. Around him, the group pressed onward, step by step, their breaths rising in clouds against the cold air. In the chaos of the crossing, one of the smaller ones stumbled. The cry was swallowed by wind, but the movement caught the giant's eye. He turned, reached through the rushing water, and lifted the small body high above his shoulders. The current slammed against him, but he did not yield. For a moment, man and river wrestled in silence, until finally he found his footing again and pushed through to the far bank. When they reached land, their breaths came heavy, but their eyes gleamed with the same fire that burned within the cave through every long winter. Around the dripping figures, the world glowed with the faint light of a new season. The river, though fierce, had been crossed. Strength had found its purpose. And in the cold heart of prehistory, purpose had found something even rarer: family. Night returned to the valley with a quiet, creeping cold. The sun had fallen behind the limestone cliffs, and the pale blue light that lingered at the horizon faded into darkness. Inside the cave, the fire burned steady. its glow pulsing across the walls like the slow rhythm of a heartbeat. Smoke drifted lazily upward, curling through the air and disappearing into the cracks of stone. Beyond the cave mouth, the wind moved through the pines with a voice that sounded almost human, a low moan that carried across the frozen plain. For the Neanderthals, this was the hour of silence, when the day's labor gave way to stillness. They sat near the fire, wrapped in the skins of hunted beasts, their faces illuminated by the soft orange light. The air was thick with the scent of pine resin, charred bone and damp earth. Children huddled close to their mothers, the warmth of their breath mixing with the smoke. The older hunters tended the coals, turning bones within the embers so that the last bits of marrow could be drawn out. Each motion was slow, measured, as though time itself had softened. The giant sat among them, his long frame casting shadows that reached the far corners of the chamber. His body still carried the marks of recovery, healed wounds, faint scars, the memory of winter's pain, but his strength had returned. In the quiet, he began to hum. The sound rose low and deep from his chest, not language but tone, the voice of a man remembering warmth. It rolled through the air like thunder softened by distance. The others lifted their heads. They did not understand the melody, yet something within it felt familiar, the pattern of breath, the rise and fall that echoed the rhythm of wind and water. Slowly, one of them picked up a hollow bone from the pile near the fire and began to tap it lightly against the stone floor. Another followed, striking a rhythm against the wall. The sound was uneven at first, then steadier, finding its pulse. The cave filled with overlapping notes of hum and percussion, the two weaving together until they became one sound, humanity's first harmony, born not from celebration but from endurance. The flickering fire painted the walls in trembling gold. Their shadows danced, long and distorted, across the surfaces where handprints and ochre marks already told the story of survival. The hum grew deeper, resonating through the chamber like a heartbeat. It was not joy, nor sorrow, but something between an acknowledgement of existence in a world that had offered them nothing freely. The music became a shelter within the shelter, a barrier against the howling wind outside. Children fell asleep to the sound, their breathing merging with the rhythm. The older ones closed their eyes, their faces softened by the calm. The storm beyond the cliffs could not touch them here. Within the flicker of flame and the vibration of sound, they had created something new, an invisible bond that required no language, no reason, only presence. As the night deepened, the hum faded into quiet. The fire dimmed, its glow shrinking to a faint red. Yet the echo of that song lingered in the stone, carried through the years like a heartbeat trapped within the earth. Long after the flames had gone cold, the cave still held its memory, the sound of two kinds of human finding peace together, their music rising softly against the endless dark. Morning light filtered into the cave in thin, golden ribbons, tracing patterns across the walls of stone. The storm had long since passed, leaving behind a sky washed clean of clouds. The air carried the scent of thawing earth and damp lichen, and the faint sound of the river echoed through the valley below. Inside, the fire burned low, its smoke mingling with the pale sunlight that reached into the cavern's depths. The hunters prepared for the day's work, the quiet ritual that would lead them once again toward the open plains. Yet before they departed, the cave demanded remembrance. For generations, the walls had held their history. The stone had seen births and deaths, hunger and healing, and now it would hold something more, a mark that would outlive every voice within it. The Neanderthals moved toward the far wall, where the surface was smooth and pale. There, scattered patches of red and yellow ochre lay crushed in shallow bowls of stone, mixed with animal fat to create a paste thick as blood. The dust carried the color of earth itself, a pigment drawn from the veins of the world. To them it was more than decoration, it was presence, a silent declaration that they had existed and endured. Each handprint told a story. They dipped their palms in pigment, placed them against the wall, and blew through hollow bones to scatter fine dust over their skin. When the hand was lifted, it left behind its negative a hollow imprint, a shadow that would not fade. One by one, the prince began to cover the stone, small and large, male and female, a family immortalized by breath and color. The giant watched from near the fire, his gaze tracing the movements of those around him. His hands, broader and longer than theirs, were instruments of both labor and survival. Slowly, he rose and approached the wall. The others stepped aside, their eyes following him in silence. He pressed his palm against the stone beside theirs, the difference immediately visible, his fingers longer, his shape more slender, his mark more foreign. Yet when the ochre settled and he lifted his hand away, it did not seem out of place. It joined the others as part of the same rhythm, bound not by origin but by the shared will to leave proof of life behind. The firelight flickered across the finished wall. Red and gold prints glowed like embers caught in stone, each one alive with meaning. The cave grew quiet as they stood before their creation. This was no act of vanity, no mere symbol, it was a covenant between flesh and time. It said that for a brief moment in the endless turning of the earth, two kinds of human had shared one fire, one struggle, one heartbeat. Outside, the sky deepened to blue. The wind carried the scent of new grass, and the distant call of the herds reminded them that the world beyond still demanded attention. Soon, they would leave the cave to hunt again. But within its walls, something lasting had been born. The ochre would fade slowly through centuries, yet even as color dimmed, the story would remain, fingers stretched toward memory, reaching through the silence of time to say, "We lived here together." As the group stepped into the morning light, their shadows fell against the mouth of the cave, briefly touching the marks they had left behind. The prints glowed faintly in the dim firelight, an ancient promise pressed into the heart of stone, a promise that would outlast them all. The warmth of spring was brief, a fleeting whisper between seasons that offered hope before vanishing once more. The sky dimmed earlier each day, the sun's arc growing shorter across the horizon. The air, once heavy with the scent of wet grass and thawing soil, turned sharp again, carrying with it the bitter promise of winter's return. The herds that had filled the plains only weeks before began to vanish northward, their silhouettes shrinking into the fog until the land was left silent and bare. The cold came back with a quiet, relentless patience. Frost spread across the ground each morning, first in small corners of shadow, then across the entire valley. Rivers froze at their edges, their surfaces glinting beneath a pale sky. The Neanderthals felt the change in the air long before the first snow fell. The forest grew still, the birds silent, the animals scarce. They began to ration their stores, boiling marrow and fat into broth, scraping hides clean to patch their furs. Within the cave, the fire became once again the heart of existence, the line between life and the darkness pressing in from beyond. The giant rose each morning before the others, stepping into the dim light with his spear in hand. His frame cast a long shadow against the frozen cliffs. He moved farther each day, following faint trails that led deeper into the wilderness. His breath came in white clouds that hung in the air before vanishing. When he returned, it was with the weight of frozen meat on his shoulders, the blood stiffened by the cold, his hands raw from the hunt. The Neanderthals greeted him in silence, their eyes reflecting the same unspoken gratitude that had passed between them since the first storm. But exhaustion began to carve its way into his body. His movements slowed, his steps heavier. The long days of pursuit, the thin air, and the gnawing hunger left their mark. The skin around his eyes hollowed, and his breath grew shallow in the cold. Yet still he went, driven not by pride or duty, but by the instinct that had once guided his kind across endless miles of unknown land to keep those around him alive, even when the world itself seemed intent on taking everything back. The Neanderthals saw the change. They noticed how he lingered by the fire longer at night, how he turned his palms toward the heat as though trying to chase the cold from his bones. They brought him marrow, shared what little they had left, placed the softest furs beneath him when he slept. Their lives had always been built upon reciprocity. Care was not kindness but survival. In saving him once, they had learned that strength was not measured by who hunted farthest, but by who endured together. The snow deepened, blanketing the mouth of the cave until only a thin stream of light could enter. The world outside seemed to disappear, leaving them suspended in silence and flickering flame. Within that isolation, a strange peace settled. The giant rested, his body weary but no longer alone. Around him, the Neanderthals moved with quiet purpose, tending to the fire, feeding the flames that pushed against the cold. Winter had returned, harsher and more unforgiving than before, but this time it found them different. They were no longer a band of strangers bound by accident. They were a family forged in endurance, each heartbeat echoing the same promise that no one would be left to fall again. Night had fallen heavy upon the valley, and the wind moved through the cracks in the cliffs like a whisper from the ice itself. The fire within the cave glowed low and steady, a faint ember against the vast darkness of the world outside. Around it, the Neanderthals worked in silence, carving strips of meat from the frozen carcass of a reindeer brought down earlier that day. The smell of blood and smoke mingled with pine resin, thickening the air until every breath carried the weight of survival. The giant knelt near the fire, his great hands steady as he cut through sinew and hide. His movements were practiced, efficient, shaped by years of hunting and endurance. The light caught the faint scars that crossed his arms and chest, reminders of battles long since fought against beasts, against weather, against hunger. But among them was one that had never truly healed. A deep wound carved into his thigh from his fall in the first winter. It had closed, but never forgotten its pain. The blade slipped only once. The movement was small, almost invisible, but it was enough. A sudden tremor of pain ran through his leg, followed by the warm sting of blood. The scar had torn open again, deep and red against the pale skin. The air changed instantly, the firelight catching the sudden flow of color that seemed too vivid for the grayness of the cave. The work around him paused, though no words were spoken. One of the Neanderthals moved closer, the eldest among them, his face carved by time and cold. He reached for a stick of burning pine, its tip glowing orange. With a slow motion, he pressed the resin-coated wood against the wound. The contact sizzled. The smell of burnt flesh filled the air, sharp and heavy, mingling with the smoke until it became one scent, the scent of endurance. The giant's jaw tightened, but no sound escaped him. He stared into the fire, eyes fixed on the flames as though drawing strength from their relentless motion. The silence inside the cave deepened. The others watched, not with fear, but with understanding. Pain was no stranger here. It was the price of every hunt, every shelter built, every life carried through the cold. To survive was to hurt, and to continue regardless. When the elder finally withdrew the wood, the bleeding had stopped. A thin line of blackened resin sealed the skin. The Neanderthal met the giant's gaze and gave a single nod, a gesture that needed no translation. Outside, snow began to fall again, drifting quietly over the valley. The cave mouth glowed faintly in the dark, the warmth inside invisible from the frozen world beyond. Within that fragile circle of firelight, the two species sat once more as equals, bound not by blood or speech, but by the shared knowledge that life endured only through the acceptance of pain. The smell of pine and ash lingered long after, seeping into the stone itself, a quiet reminder that in the age of ice, courage was never loud. It was the steady act of continuing to live. The valley had known silence for many weeks. The wind had softened, the snow had settled, and the rhythm of life had returned to its steady, ancient pattern. The Neanderthals moved between the forest edge and the open plain, gathering wood, hunting small game, and tending the fire that never fully went out. The cave had become a fortress of warmth against a continent wrapped in ice. But peace, in the world of early humans, was only ever borrowed. One morning, as dawn broke pale and cold across the horizon, that fragile stillness was disturbed. It began with a line of marks in the snow, shallow, narrow, and evenly spaced. They cut across the plain in a pattern too deliberate to be animal, too light to belong to those who lived within the cave. The prints were human, but not theirs. The giant saw them first, his eyes tracing the trail that led from the horizon toward the low ridge above their shelter. The shape of the impressions, the length of the stride, the faint drag of a hunting spear in the snow, all of it spoke to him with terrifying clarity. He knew this pattern. These were not wanderers. They were hunters, and they were his kind. The discovery carried the weight of memory. Somewhere beyond the ice and wind, he had once walked among those same feet, hunted beside them, shared their fires. But that was another life, a life that had ended on the day he fell beneath the snow and was left behind. Now, they were no longer his kin. To them, he would be something else, an outcast, a ghost, perhaps even a threat. The Neanderthals who had saved him would be seen not as companions, but as rivals, competitors for the same scarce prey. The trail of footprints told a story as old as survival itself, where humans met, conflict followed. The air grew tense, as if the forest itself could feel the intrusion. The giant examined the tracks again, noting the freshness of the snow disturbed. The prints were recent hours, not days. The hunters were near, moving through the valley with purpose. He turned back toward the cave where the Neanderthals worked in quiet routine, unaware of what approached. The light of the fire flickered faintly at the mouth of the shelter, too warm, too visible against the cold gray morning. He understood that the others would not recognize the danger until it was upon them. The hunters of his kind did not approach openly. They watched first. They studied. They waited for weakness before striking. Every instinct within him remembered their methods, their discipline, their silence before violence. The footprints were not random. They formed a crescent shape, the pattern of an ambush closing in. The wind rose again, sweeping across the valley and blurring the edges of the trail, as though the land itself wished to conceal what was coming. The giant moved to the cave's entrance, his breath heavy in the cold air. Beyond the ridge, the white plain stretched endlessly toward the horizon, beautiful and empty, yet filled with unseen eyes. He watched the snow swirl, listened to the stillness, and knew that the world of his past had found him once more. Inside the cave, the fire crackled softly, unaware of the danger drawing near. The prints outside grew fainter with each passing gust, but their meaning remained. The land was no longer silent. It had become a boundary between two families of human, two ways of living, two fates that could not share the same fire. And somewhere out in that endless expanse of white, the hunters kept walking, following the trail of the one who had escaped the cold and found something even rarer than survival. He had found belonging, and now the world had come to take it back. Dusk fell like a slow eclipse over the valley. The sky, once pale and open, deepened into a curtain of indigo, and the first stars began to flicker through the haze of gathering snow. The world seemed hushed, wrapped in the expectant stillness that precedes violence. The wind carried no warning, only the faint rustle of pine needles and the distant creak of ice shifting along the river. But beneath that calm, something moved. Something deliberate, quiet, and human. The Neanderthals had retreated early into the cave, their day's work finished, their fire rekindled for the night. The flames climbed higher than usual, licking at the soot-stained ceiling, filling the chamber with warmth. Shadows of figures stretched along the stone, their movements soft and rhythmic as they prepared the evening meal. The scent of burning pine and roasted marrow filled the air, a fragile comfort against the cold. Outside, darkness swallowed the last traces of daylight. Then came the first sound, thin, sharp, almost delicate. A whisper through the air, followed by the dull crack of stone on rock. The hunters had arrived. They came as silhouettes against the snow, light-footed and cautious, moving with the precision of those who had tracked prey all their lives. Their bows were crude but deadly, their arrows tipped with bone and fire-hardened points. They had followed the giant's trail for days, watching the smoke rise from the cliffs, waiting for the right moment to strike. To them, the cave was not a home. It was a rival stronghold, a claim upon food, territory, and survival itself. The air split with the hiss of an arrow. It struck the stone near the cave mouth, splintering into shards that scattered across the ground. Another followed, then another, until the sound became a rhythm, a deadly rain of silence broken by impact. The Neanderthals froze, only for a heartbeat before the instinct of countless generations took over. They reached for their weapons, heavy clubs of antler and flint, built not for distance but for the closeness of struggle. The fire roared brighter as one of them fed it dry wood, the light flaring out into the snow like a signal to the oncoming dark. The attackers advanced, their figures shifting through the storm. The giant moved to the mouth of the cave, his massive frame outlined by the fire's glow. In one hand, he held a burning branch torn from the hearth, its end ablaze with orange light. The flames cast a halo around him, turning his breath to steam and his shadow into something enormous. The first of the hunters hesitated. The sight before them was not what they expected, one of their own kind, standing among those they sought to kill, guarding them as if they were kin. The moment broke as quickly as it formed. Another arrow hissed through the air, grazing the rock beside him. The giant stepped forward, sweeping the burning branch in wide arcs. Sparks scattered into the snow, and the attackers faltered. The firelight dazzled their eyes, destroying their night vision. Behind him, the Neanderthals charged forward with guttural cries, swinging their clubs with terrifying strength. The sound of stone striking bone echoed through the gorge, mingling with the roar of the fire. The battle lasted only moments. The cold and the light did what no weapon could. Blinded, disoriented, and terrified by the blaze, the hunters fell back into the storm. Their retreat left nothing but the echo of footsteps and the faint smell of burned wood. When silence finally returned, it came heavy and complete. Inside the cave, the fire still burned high, its flames crackling over the remains of shattered arrows. Smoke curled toward the ceiling, thick and dark, carrying with it the scent of survival. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and slow, covering the marks of conflict as though the earth itself wished to forget. The night that followed was long, but it was not fearful. The firelight glowed steady, and around it, two kinds of humans sat side by side, their faces lit by the same warmth. The cave had been defended, the bond between them tested and proven. In a world ruled by cold and hunger, the fire had become something greater than heat or light. It had become defiance, a living wall between extinction and endurance. The night after the attack was heavy with silence. The wind had quieted, but the echo of the battle lingered like smoke that refused to fade. The snow outside the cave had begun to harden again, covering footprints and scattered arrows, softening the evidence of violence beneath a thin white crust. The stars returned, cold and indifferent, watching the earth below where warmth and life still clung to the narrow space between survival and loss. Inside the cave, the fire that had once blazed in defiance now burned low, its energy spent. The air was thick with the mingled smells of ash, blood, and pine resin. The walls flickered faintly with the dying light, each flame revealing the stillness that had settled among them. The Neanderthals sat in quiet exhaustion, their broad shoulders hunched, their faces lit in amber tones. They had fought for what was theirs, fire, shelter, the fragile continuity of their small world, and they had won. But the victory carried weight. Near the center of the cave lay the one who had not risen again. His body was still, his face calm beneath the soot and blood that stained his brow. The firelight touched him gently, painting his features in gold and shadow. Around him, the others worked in silence, tending to the wounded, binding cuts with sinew, and pressing moss against bruises. Their movements were deliberate, reverent, as though they understood the cost of what the night had taken. The cave was quiet but alive with the subtle sound of breath of grief restrained, of fatigue too deep for words. The giant sat close to the fallen one, his frame hunched, his great hand resting upon the warrior's chest. The rhythm of his breath matched the slow crackle of the coals. He did not move for a long time, watching the faint shimmer of embers that glowed like dying stars. The battle had given him back the gift of belonging, but it had also reminded him of its price. He had seen death before among his own kind, in hunts gone wrong, in winters too long, but this loss carried something different. It was personal, human, in a way that reached beyond tribe or species. Outside, the horizon began to pale. The first light of dawn crept over the frozen hills, turning the snow into silver glass. The air inside the cave shifted as the cold found its way in, brushing against their skin like a reminder of the world's indifference. Yet even as the temperature dropped, the circle around the fire tightened. The Neanderthals remained close to one another, their shapes merging in the dim light, their quiet unity stronger than any words. By the time the sun broke the line of the cliffs, the fire had nearly gone out. Only faint traces of smoke drifted toward the ceiling. The giant rose slowly and placed another branch onto the coals. The flames caught, small but persistent, climbing upward through the ashes of the night before. The fire's return filled the space with warmth once more, a quiet symbol that life would continue. The world outside remained as harsh as ever, but inside that cave, something unspoken had completed its circle. Once, the Neanderthals had saved the life of a stranger. Now he had guarded theirs, standing between them and the darkness that sought to claim it. In the stillness of dawn, among the soft crackle of rekindled flame, the balance of survival had been restored. And for a brief, fleeting moment, in an age ruled by cold, the warmth of shared endurance felt stronger than the winter waiting beyond the stone walls. The dawn that followed was colorless, a pale wash of light stretching across a world of ice and silence. The air was thin and brittle, sharp enough to sting the lungs with every breath. The valley that had sheltered them through storms and seasons was no longer safe. The cold had begun its slow conquest again, creeping down from the mountains, swallowing the rivers, and freezing the lowlands that once teemed with life. The herds had vanished to the north, and with them went the promise of food. The land itself was shifting, reshaping under the weight of advancing ice. It was time to move. They prepared in silence. The cave, once filled with warmth and voices, stood hollow and still. The fire pit was dark, the walls blackened with smoke, the handprints faded beneath a thin coat of frost. What had once been home was now only memory. The Neanderthals gathered their furs, their tools, and what food remained. The body of their fallen companion was wrapped in hide, bound carefully with sinew. The giant lifted it in his arms, his massive frame steady against the wind. There was no ceremony, no farewell, only motion, the quiet acceptance that life demanded movement, even through grief. The journey north began beneath a sky of unbroken gray. The snow came in waves, blurring the line between ground and air, until the world seemed to dissolve into one endless, shifting field of white. Each step sank deep, the sound muffled beneath layers of powder. Their breaths hung heavy around them, forming clouds that rose and vanished with the wind. The cold pressed against their faces, biting through fur and skin, testing endurance with every mile, but they did not turn back. The instinct that had carried them through countless seasons, the will to follow, to adapt, to endure, kept them moving. The land grew harsher as they climbed. Great walls of ice rose on either side, glittering in the dim light like frozen waves. Beneath their feet, the snow crusted over hidden rivers, and cracks groaned in the distance like the earth's slow breathing. The giant walked ahead, breaking a path through the drifts, his strength carving a trail for those behind him. The Neanderthals followed in his wake, their smaller forms steady and deliberate, their unity unbroken even as the world around them fell away. When they reached the higher valley, the air grew clearer. The wind subsided, revealing a vast expanse that stretched toward the horizon. It was a land untouched, raw and unclaimed, where the ice had not yet reached. They built a small camp among the rocks, stacking stones to block the wind. The giant laid the wrapped body gently into the snow and covered it with stones, each one placed with care. The others joined in, their breaths forming mist that shimmered in the low light. No words were spoken. None were needed. The act itself was language enough. As night fell, the northern lights unfurled across the sky, a curtain of green and blue that rippled over the frozen peaks. The fire burned low, its reflection dancing in the eyes of those who watched. Around it sat a group of survivors, two species that had learned to live as one. The land had taken everything from them but had also given them something far greater than warmth or shelter. It had given them each other. The ice would continue its march. The world would grow colder, smaller, more fragile. Yet beneath that endless winter sky, their bond remained an ember of shared endurance, glowing faintly against the vast, unfeeling dark. The hidden valley revealed itself like a secret kept by the earth. After days of trudging through white wilderness and wind that carved their faces raw, the travelers descended from the glacial ridge and saw a place untouched by the full grip of ice. The cliffs curved inward, forming a shelter from the endless storms, and at the center of it, a narrow stream cut through the frozen soil. Steam rose faintly from its surface where the water ran over smooth stones, never freezing even in the coldest hours. It was a pocket of warmth in a world that had almost forgotten what warmth felt like. They settled there, drawn by instinct as much as necessity. Beneath the overhanging rock, the cliff formed a natural roof, its underside darkened by minerals and ancient soot from fires that had burned long before their arrival. The ground was dry and shielded from the biting wind. Nearby, the forest clung to life, thin pines standing like survivors themselves, their branches heavy with frost. It was here, in this fragile sanctuary between ice and earth, that they began again. The Neanderthals worked as one, their movements practiced and rhythmic. They shaped walls of hide stretched over frames of mammoth bone, weighting them with stones to resist the wind. Their hands, thick and strong, moved with precision born from countless winters. The giant helped lift the heaviest bones into place, driving them deep into the ground to form arches of shelter. The smell of pine smoke returned as the first fires were built, curling upward in gentle threads that vanished into the overhang's shadow. Days found a new pattern. The giant hunted across the plains, following the trails of mammoth and bison that still roamed the northern edge of the valley. His figure moved alone through the whiteness, tall and dark against the snow, returning with meat frozen solid and tusks that glistened like stone. The Neanderthals gathered roots and seeds from beneath the frost, digging where they remembered life once hid. They chipped new tools from the rocks of the streambed, shaping flint edges so fine they could split bone with a single blow. Survival became not just a fight, but a rhythm, a quiet collaboration between strength and patience. As the weeks passed, the hidden valley grew familiar. The firelight at night flickered against the cliffs, turning their makeshift dwellings into small islands of gold in a sea of blue shadow. Smoke rose into the air and drifted over the stream, where the sound of running water softened the silence. The scent of marrow broth, pine resin, and wet hide filled the narrow space, reminding them that even in the heart of winter, life persisted. The giant's presence no longer felt foreign. Around the fires, his shadow merged with theirs, his hands working alongside their own. In this frozen refuge, the boundaries between them faded. They were no longer two species, but one community bound by the oldest law the earth had ever written, that survival favored those who shared. Seasons shifted almost imperceptibly. The pale light lingered longer each day, and the bite of the wind dulled. Icicles dripped from the cliffside as the sun found strength again. The hidden valley had held them through another cycle of time, a small defiance against the endless cold. Above them the glaciers still advanced, carving the mountains, reshaping the world beyond sight. Yet here, beneath the cliffs, the fire still burned. The stream still sang its quiet song beneath the frost. And within that narrow, sheltered world, the bond between Neanderthal and human remained unbroken, a fragile, flickering thread of endurance in an age ruled by ice. Winter settled over the hidden valley once more, though its cold felt gentler here than in the open plains beyond. Snow gathered along the edges of the overhang, and the stream that wound through the camp continued to flow, its quiet murmuring a constant reminder that even in the harshest seasons, movement meant life. The fires burned low and steady through the long nights, their smoke rising into the blackness above, carrying with it the scent of pine resin and mammoth fat. In this narrow refuge, carved between stone and frost, a quiet miracle was about to take place, one that would change the story of humankind forever. The Neanderthal women worked silently beside the hearth, tending to the furs and feeding the flames, their faces calm with patience. Their world had always been measured by endurance: the hunt, the harvest, the birth, the burial. Life was a cycle carved by the cold and bound together by warmth. That winter, the youngest among them carried the weight of new life within her, her body both fragile and powerful in equal measure. Around her, the tribe moved carefully, their gestures slow, protective. Even the giant, whose immense frame towered above them all, seemed to move with a quiet reverence in her presence. When the child finally arrived, it came not with cries or shouts but with stillness. The fire burned bright that night, its light pulsing softly against the walls of the shelter. Outside, the snow drifted down in silence, as if the world itself was pausing to witness. The child's skin was pale, its face broad like the Neanderthals, yet its limbs were slender, its eyes wide and bright, reflecting the flicker of flame with an intelligence both familiar and strange. The tribe gathered close, their breath mingling in the cool air, the rhythm of their hearts steady as one. They called the child Between. It was not a name of ownership, but of meaning, a word that carried the weight of discovery. Between two kinds of human, between old and new, between the fire that had burned for generations and the one that would outlive them all. In that moment, something unseen had shifted. The world had drawn two lines that now crossed within a single heartbeat. The days that followed were filled with a subtle brightness that even the cold could not dim. The child was cradled near the fire, wrapped in hides that smelled of smoke and pine. The giant often sat nearby, his massive hands steady as he shaped stone and wood. The Neanderthals watched with quiet affection, their eyes softening at the small noises that broke the silence of the cave. It was as though this single life had become the axis upon which their fragile world now turned. Outside, the wind carved new paths through the snow, reshaping the landscape with each passing day. Herds moved in the distance, their silhouettes faint through the frost, and the first traces of returning light painted the cliffs in muted gold. The tribe worked together as always, hunting, gathering, keeping the fires alive, but now each action carried a deeper purpose. Every breath, every spark from the hearth, felt as though it existed to protect that small, fragile presence between them. In the stillness of those winter nights, when the firelight danced across the cave walls, the shadows of Neanderthal and modern human intertwined like the hands that had once left marks in ochre. The child slept through the sound of the stream, through the slow breathing of the valley, through the eternal hum of the earth itself. Life had taken a new form, quiet but profound. Beneath the cliffs, surrounded by firelight and snow, the first bridge between two worlds had been born. And though none of them could know it, the legacy of that child, the one they called Between, would ripple through the ages, carried forward in every pulse of blood that followed, proof that even in the coldest age, life always finds a way to endure. The second winter came without mercy. The winds that once whispered through the cliffs now screamed through the valleys, carrying the taste of snow and hunger. The hidden stream that had refused to freeze in the year before now lay locked beneath a shell of ice, its faint trickle barely audible beneath the crust. The herds that had once crossed the plains in slow, thunderous procession were gone, their tracks buried beneath endless storms. The earth itself seemed to have retreated, holding back its life until the cold would loosen its grip again. Inside the valley, the Neanderthals and the giant endured as best they could. Their fires burned small now, the wood rationed carefully, each flame a fragile heartbeat against the advancing cold. They scraped the last remnants of marrow from the bones, boiled hides to draw out any trace of fat, and searched the frozen soil for roots that could still be pried loose. The smell of smoke hung thick in the air, mixing with the sharp scent of pine and the faint bitterness of desperation. The giant continued to hunt, though the land offered little. His frame had grown leaner, his strength carved down to endurance alone. Each morning, before the sun could pierce the frost-heavy clouds, he set out across the plains with his spear in hand. His footprints trailed into the whiteness, disappearing beyond the cliffs. He returned with less each time, a rabbit once, a strip of sinew another day, and often nothing at all. The cold claimed what it wished to claim, and there was little any creature could do but keep moving. Within the shelter, the others grew weaker too. The oldest among them spent most days beside the fire, their breaths shallow and eyes clouded with the fatigue of survival. The children huddled together beneath furs, their small hands clutched close to their chests. The giant watched them quietly, his gaze steady, his face calm even as the sharp ache of hunger pressed deeper into his body. When the final stores of meat were gone, he gave what remained of his share to the young ones. The gesture passed without ceremony, without words, only the simple understanding that one life could buy time for another. The Neanderthals accepted it as they did all things with solemn grace. He kept only snow water for himself, drinking in slow, deliberate sips, the cold biting his throat but quieting the hunger within. Days blurred together, marked only by the dim glow of firelight and the shifting color of the sky outside the cave. The storms came and went, erasing every track, burying every trace of what had once been a living world. Yet through it all, the giant's eyes remained gentle. There was no fear in them, no regret, only the quiet reflection of flame and snow. In time, the cold eased its assault. The storms began to fade, their fury spent. The faint warmth of returning light brushed the cliffs once more. The Neanderthals stirred, thinner now, but alive. The fire still burned, weak but steady, fed by the last of the dry branches. Beside it, the giant lay resting, his breathing soft and even, his great hands open upon the stone. He had given everything he could, his strength turned into survival for those he called family. Outside, the first rays of spring touched the valley, glinting off the ice like fragments of gold. Life, small and stubborn, would return to this place. And though one heart had stilled, its warmth lived on in those who remained in the fire that refused to die, in the faces that had been fed by his will. The famine had not taken them all. It had taken one, who gave what he had so others might see another dawn. Night descended over the hidden valley with the stillness of deep snow. The wind that had howled for days finally fell silent, leaving the world wrapped in a muffled calm. The fire inside the shelter burned low, its glow reduced to a soft amber pulse that flickered weakly against the dark walls. The smoke rose in thin threads that vanished into the blackness above, and with every slow hiss of the coals, the sound of life seemed to grow quieter. The air was cold enough to crystallize breath, and yet the warmth that filled the cave was not from flame, it came from the gathering of bodies, the closeness of beings who had endured everything the earth could throw against them. The giant lay near the center, his massive frame curled close to the hearth that had once burned high with light. His breathing was shallow, almost imperceptible, each inhale a struggle against the weight of exhaustion. The firelight painted his face in shifting tones of gold and shadow, revealing the deep lines of wear that time and cold had carved into him. Around him, the Neanderthals kept their vigil in silence. Theirs was not the stillness of despair, but of understanding. In a world ruled by the elements, they knew death was not an enemy but a companion, one who came for all things when the season was right. The old woman who had found him once, long ago, moved closer. Her hair was streaked with gray, her eyes soft with the calm of age. She placed her hand upon his chest, feeling the faint rhythm that still lingered there. It was steady but fragile, like the tremor of a flame before it goes out. She lowered her forehead to his, her breath clouding faintly in the cold air. No words passed between them. They needed none. The bond they shared was older than language, older than the fires that had warmed their lives. The others gathered closer, their shapes forming a living wall around the dying fire. The child, the one born of two worlds, watched from the edge, eyes wide in the dim light. The giant's gaze drifted toward the flames, and for a moment, it seemed he saw beyond them, beyond the cave, beyond the night, into a world that stretched further than even the ice could reach. His breathing slowed, his chest rose once more, and then stilled. The hiss of the embers filled the silence that followed, soft and eternal. Outside, snow began to fall again, slow and soundless, covering the valley in a fresh white shroud. The stream still murmured beneath its thin crust of ice, its voice steady and patient as ever. The Neanderthals did not weep. They sat together, their faces turned toward the fading fire, feeling the warmth that still radiated from its core. In time, they would lay him to rest beneath the stones, as they had done for their own, marking the place with care. But for now, they simply remained guardians of the flame he had helped them keep alive. By dawn, the sky began to pale, a faint gray glow spreading across the mountains. The last spark in the hearth flickered and died, but the warmth it had given lingered in the air, in their breath, in the rhythm of their hearts. Outside, the snow lay smooth and unbroken, untouched by the wind. The giant's story had ended. But his gift, the fire that united them, still burned quietly in those who survived. And as the light of morning crept through the valley, it seemed for a moment that even the earth itself paused to remember him. Morning broke slowly over the valley, the light crawling across the snow like a reluctant awakening. The storm had passed, leaving a silence so complete that even the air seemed to hold its breath. Frost glittered on the cliffs, and the stream that wound through the basin whispered softly beneath a thin sheet of ice. The cold, though biting, was clear and still, the kind of cold that preserved memory. Inside the shelter beneath the overhang, the fire had burned to ash, its last embers faint and gray. What warmth remained came not from flame, but from the quiet gathering of those left behind. They had seen death before, but this was different. The figure that now rested at the center of the cave had not been born of their kind, yet he had become one of them. His great frame was now still, his face peaceful in the pale light. The Neanderthals moved with deliberate care, guided not by ritual in the sense of belief, but by instinct, the shared understanding that life, once given, deserved to be remembered. Theirs was a reverence born from the ancient rhythm of existence, where death was not an ending but a return. They began by wrapping his body in hides softened by smoke and time, layering them carefully, each fold pressed flat and secure. The scent of fur and ash filled the air. His spear, the same one he had carried across the plains, was placed beside him, its wooden shaft polished by his hands and the journey it had endured. It was not an offering, but a part of him, as necessary in death as it had been in life. Outside, the ground was hard, but not unyielding. Together, they cleared the snow near the edge of the valley, where the morning light touched first. They dug into the frozen soil with flint and bone, breaking through the frost until they reached earth soft enough to cradle the weight of a body. When it was ready, they carried him out from the shelter. The movement was slow, solemn, their steps crunching softly against the snow. The cold air bit at their faces, but none turned away. They laid him in the hollow they had carved, the hides forming a cocoon against the frozen world. Around him they scattered small stones and bits of ochre earth dyed red by iron, a color that to them was more than pigment. It was the color of blood, of fire, of life itself. With careful hands, they began to press the ochre into the soil around him, tinting the snow a deep, muted crimson. Then, stone by stone, they built a circle around the grave. Each stone bore the mark of a handprint pressed in ash, the shapes overlapping until no single identity could be separated from the rest. When the circle was complete, the youngest among them approached. The child moved closer to the still figure, holding a single white feather, plucked from a bird that had once drifted through the valley sky. It was placed gently upon his chest, resting over the place where his heartbeat had once thundered with life. The tribe stepped back and lit their torches. The firelight shimmered against the snow, golden against the gray morning. Together, they began to hum a sound low and resonant, echoing through the valley like wind moving through stone. It was not song as we know it, but a vibration of memory, an offering to the silence. The tones blended until they became one voice, one breath, one heartbeat shared among them all. When the hum faded, dawn had arrived. The light crept across the circle of stones, catching the feather first, then spreading to the edges where the red earth glowed beneath the frost. The Neanderthals stood for a moment longer, watching the sun touch the resting place of the one they had called their own. Then, slowly, they turned back toward the shelter. Behind them, the burial remained stones and color, handprints and silence. It would outlast them all, In that frozen world, beneath the endless sky, a memory had been anchored to the land. For the first time in human history, two branches of the same lineage had stood together in grief, their shared fire now passed into the ground. And in that quiet valley, the earth itself seemed to listen, holding the story of the giant who had once lived, fought, and given everything for those who chose to keep him as one of their own. Spring came to the valley like a long-forgotten memory. It arrived quietly, without ceremony, seeping into the land through thaw and trickle rather than sudden warmth. The snow retreated in slow, hesitant lines, pulling back to reveal the dark soil beneath. The frozen stream awoke first, its surface cracking open to release a sound that was half sigh, half song. Water flowed again through the heart of the valley, carrying with it the reflection of a sun that seemed brighter now, though the air remained cold enough to bite. For the Neanderthals who remained, the turning of the season felt both familiar and strange. The earth was returning to life, as it always had. Yet the valley carried a stillness it had not known before. The circle of stones at the edge of the clearing stood untouched, their handprints faded but visible, the red earth beneath them glowing faintly through the melt. Even as the days grew longer, the wind that passed over that place seemed to move differently, gentler, as if unwilling to disturb the memory that rested there. The tribe rebuilt their world piece by piece. The shelters were mended, hides stretched and sewn with bone needles, and the fires relit with the care of those who understood that flame was a fragile inheritance. The hunts resumed, though the herds were fewer and farther than before. They learned to fish the shallows of the river and to dig for roots in the damp soil. Each act of survival was quiet and deliberate, shaped by the rhythm of patience. Yet woven through their days was something more than routine, a sense of remembrance that lingered in the way they moved, in the way their eyes turned to the cliffs when evening came. At night, when the fires were lit and the sky deepened to the color of ash and stars, they gathered in a circle as they always had. The flames painted their faces gold and bronze, and the walls behind them flickered with the motion of life. It was then that they spoke of him, the tall one who had come from the storm, who had carried their wounded, shared his food, and stood guard when danger came. They did not speak in words as we know them, but in sounds that carried weight, tone, and rhythm, in gestures that spoke of strength, sacrifice, and the strange gentleness of a man who was not one of their own yet had become family. His story passed from the mouths of the elders to the ears of the young, carried in the flicker of light and the hum that rose low and steady from their throats. It was not a tale of conquest or dominance, but of balance, a story about how the cold world could soften for a moment when two fires met and refused to die. The valley began to bloom again. Grass emerged from the thawing ground, and small flowers pushed through the cracks between stones. Birds returned, their cries echoing through the cliffs, and the herds came once more to graze by the river. Life, patient and enduring, reclaimed what the ice had taken. The Neanderthals moved among these changes like caretakers of an old promise. Each evening, as the fire's glow reached toward the sky, one of them would turn to the place of stones and watch the wind stir the red earth there. They no longer saw him in body, yet his presence remained in the warmth of the flame, in the strength of the hunt, in the laughter that returned to their shelter. The story of the giant had become more than memory, it had become inheritance. And so the season after was not a season of forgetting, but of continuation. The valley lived again, but it was no longer the same valley. It held within it the imprint of a life shared across two kinds of human, a mark pressed into the fabric of time as surely as those handprints on the stone. And as the fire crackled beneath the awakening sky, the tribe's quiet song rose once more into the evening air, carrying his story to the wind, to the river, and to the waiting world beyond the ice. Time passed quietly in the hidden valley. The winters returned, though not as fierce as before, and the summers stretched longer, marked by the slow greening of the slopes and the hum of insects rising from the thaw. The stream, faithful and unbroken, continued its endless journey through the stone basin, singing the same song it had when the first fire burned beneath the overhang. Seasons came and went in cycles, and with them, generations rose and fell like the tide of the land itself. The memory of the storm, of the giant, of hunger and salvation, faded not as a story ends, but as a seed buried in soil unseen, yet alive. The tribe endured. Children grew where the old ones had once stood, and their laughter filled the cave where grief had once echoed. Their tools became sharper, their shelters stronger, their songs richer in tone. But beneath these new layers of living, the old pulse remained the one that had bound them together in the age of ice, when survival depended not only on strength but on compassion. Around every fire that followed, that pulse was rekindled, flickering in the same rhythm as before, the same ancient heartbeat that had once guided two species through a shared winter. One evening, many years after the snow had last claimed the valley, the tribe gathered once more within the old shelter. The air smelled of smoke and pine, and the glow of the flames turned the cave walls golden. The younger ones played near the stream while the elders sat in silence, their eyes turned toward the walls that had watched their ancestors live and die. There, beneath centuries of soot and dust, the prints still waited, hands upon stone, a record of presence. The walls were a mosaic of touch. Some prints were small and round, belonging to children who had grown beneath this roof and learned to see the fire as life itself. Others were broader, heavier, shaped by years of labor and cold. But among them all, half-faded, barely visible beneath the red ochre and age, was one larger than the rest. Its outline was long and slender, the fingers reaching higher than any of the others. The years had softened its edges, but it remained a trace of the one who had come from the storm, whose strength had shielded them, whose kindness had redefined it. The tribe did not speak his name. None remembered the words that might have once described him. Yet when they pressed their palms against the stone beside that ancient mark, they felt the weight of continuity, the quiet understanding that they were not alone in their story. The fire crackled behind them, the sound deep and rhythmic, as if answering the silence. Outside, the valley glowed beneath the evening light. The stream shimmered in the dusk, reflecting the last colors of the setting sun. Smoke rose from the hearth and drifted toward the sky, joining the clouds that moved slowly eastward. The world was changing, ice retreating, forests spreading, but the memory of the bond formed here remained carved into the bones of the earth. Generations later, when other humans would walk these same valleys, they would find the cave. They would see the prints on the walls, the red pigment clinging stubbornly to stone, and they would wonder who had made them. They would trace their fingers over the ancient impressions and notice, among the many, the one that did not fit the great hand of another kind, pressed beside those of smaller, broader shape. And though no one would know the story in full, something unspoken would linger in that place. The feeling that once, long before the world had words or nations or history, two kinds of human had shared a single fire. That in a time ruled by ice, strength had learned gentleness, and survival had learned grace. The flame flickered, faded, and rose again in countless forms. But the memory remained, etched in stone, whispering through ages. In the end, the fire was never just warmth, it was memory itself, keeping alive the truth that even in the coldest age, the heart of humanity had already begun to burn.